Last week we began our summer sermon series with the preamble that while the series title says the challenges of being a church, we are really focusing on the challenges of being this church. Our series is designed to provoke and initiate conversations about who we are, who God is calling us to be, and how we do the work of building God's kingdom here and now. Last week we were reminded that, as the prophet wrote, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." We have been called to be a downtown church, and even when we had the opportunity to leave the downtown, we felt the call to stay. As our city develops and is revitalized, we, as a downtown congregation, can be a part of that renewing work, and in the process, find ourselves renewed. This week, let's start a conversation about being a compassionate church. It's not that we aren't already. It's just that we live in such uncompassionate times, and the ideas of consideration, care, and kindness are far too absent from our nation and our world. Our world has become a cold, indifferent, and even mean-spirited place. That is not what the world God created the world and all that calls it home to be. When you look at the word compassion, you'll discover that it is formed of two Latin words, com or con, meaning with, and passio, meaning suffering. To have compassion for someone is to literally suffer with that person. To have compassion is to enter into the suffering of another human being or group of human beings, or take it even further, to enter into the suffering of any sentient, conscious being. Compassion is different from empathy, for empathy asks us to understand another's situation and feelings. Compassion is different from sympathy, for sympathy asks us to feel something of what the other is feeling. Compassion asks us to go to a place in our hearts and minds that we do not want to go. Pema Chodron, a Buddhist nun and well-known author, tells us, compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It is a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness can we be present in the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. Compassion for one who is sick requires us to remember when we were sick, what it felt like, the pain, the frustration, the anger, the impatience. Compassion for one who mourns requires us to willingly walk back into the valley of the shadow and remember the sadness, the aloneness, the loss, the pain, the heartbreak. Compassion requires more of us than assent or understanding. Henri Nouwen tells us compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into the places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion into the condition of being human. So why are we talking about this? Simply because compassion is a God thing. Rabbi Mazo reminded us a few weeks back that we were created in the image of God. That means that the qualities of God's character and being are to be present in our character and being. In the psalm for the day, we were reminded, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy, slow to anger, and abounding in great kindness. Compassionate is who God is. God entered into our suffering in the person of Jesus Christ to be with us in the muck and mire of our broken humanity. In the New Testament lesson from the letter to the Colossians, we are instructed to clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. Among the qualities of authentic Christian living, we find our word, compassion. We are to wear it like we wear our clothing. I hope we are agreed that none of us would ever go out of the house without our clothes. In the same way, we are never to be without compassion, for this is at the very heart of being a true disciple of Jesus Christ. Presbyterian author and minister Frederick Buechner has said, compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity for feeling what it is like to live inside somebody else's skin. It's the knowledge that there can never be, really never be, any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy finally for you too. As God put on our skin in the selfless act we call the incarnation and lived among us in the midst of our brokenness, showing us the way to wholeness, we are called to put on the skin of those around us who are broken and dispirited and lead them in the way of wholeness. And that is never easy. If it were, the world would be a lovely place. Andrew Boyd reminds us, compassion hurts. When you feel connected to everything, you also feel responsible for everything, and you cannot turn away. Your destiny is bound to the destinies of others. You must either learn to carry the universe or be crushed by it. You must grow strong enough to love the world, but empty enough to sit down at the same table with its worst horrors. In his book, Boyd is actually trying to be sarcastic, but he has spoken the truth. Compassion hurts, and we would just as soon avoid it if at all possible. Compassion leaves us vulnerable. Compassion places us in arenas of discomfort. Compassion bids us to go against the current of the world around us. Compassion calls us to a life with which the world is totally unfamiliar. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer told us, compassion is the basis of morality. Authentic moral living requires compassion. It is the heartbeat of a principled living, a notion that too often escapes the notice of those in places of authority. If you're looking to change the world, compassion is a pretty good place to start. But it's more than that. Compassion means that we lead with our hearts, even at times when our minds tell us to do otherwise. There are times when compassion doesn't make fiscal sense. Compassion can put us in the place of choosing between doing for ourselves and doing for another. To the calloused heart, there is no choice at all. You do for yourself. But to the compassionate heart, the choice is more challenging. For in entering into the pain and suffering of another, we may experience our own pain and suffering. John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress and so much more, told us, "You have not lived until you have done something for someone who can never repay you. Compassion is never a quid pro quo, a this for that. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. More often than not, compassionate living will exact a cost from us that we will never see returned. Sometimes that cost is financial. Sometimes we must give some of what we have in order that others can have something of their own. Our giving through the church seeks to be a channel through which compassion can flow into the world in the form of good news, food, water, shelter, healing, education, justice, and bringing wholeness to the broken world. Sometimes the cost of compassion is social. Sometimes practicing compassion upsets our family and friends because it's so countercultural. Remember Mark Twain's statement, always do right. This will gratify some and astonish the rest. And add to it this, and sometimes it will upset and anger a few more. Compassion is not without its consequences. There's your warning. That the world is a broken and hurting place is no news. But if the world is to find wholeness and healing, it will be up to the church and this church to be practitioners of compassion in bold and new ways. Too many churches and denominations are too willing to reflect the unfriendliness and enmity that exists in the world. First Presbyterian Church must continue to be and discover new ways of being a place where compassion is the norm. We must guard ourselves against the cynicism and distrust so present in the world, both in the church and in society. We must give ourselves away to those who are sick, who are hungry, who are lonely, who are the subjects of discrimination, who are broken in heart, who are held captive in addiction, and those who are rejected by those who should love them most. We must be willing to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. And let's close with this. The Dalai Lama offers us this instruction. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Clothe yourselves with that. It's what the best-dressed folks are wearing this season. Compassion for now and evermore. Amen.